I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning.
Good morning.
I'm glad that you're here joining us. And I want to talk to you about a couple of different bills, but since you ended on the national popular vote, I guess we'll start there. I've heard this a lot of times, the notion of one person, one vote. But as you know, we are not a democracy. We're a representative republic. And I guess what I would say about that is just to ask a pointed question, which is, can you imagine a situation where the state of Connecticut voted en masse for one candidate? Maybe everybody does. But we still lose the national popular vote by some margin. In a situation like that, aren't we also disenfranchising every voter in the state of Connecticut?
I get to answer. Again, I'm not going to belabor a lot of this because I'm sure there are lots of people that are wanting to talk about this. But I would just say it's the way we do every other election, including your own. So it would be the same issue. Whenever you're voting, all other elections are handled in the way that one person gets one vote in that particular election. And sometimes it's going to mean you'd have to ignore state lines. Now, I know how I would feel if that were my candidate and I were in Connecticut. But I think you have to look at the national picture. It is a national vote. And so for me, that would still override that.
Yeah, I can certainly respect that. I mean, it was just a couple of years that it was the Republican Party pushing the national popular vote. I don't know if anybody in this room knows that, but you can go back a couple of years and you can find a lot of documents and various handouts and that kind of thing, because they felt that that was the only way we were ever going to achieve a win on a national level. So I think it's the kind of thing that can cut both ways, and I would caution being careful about a decision like that, because that's something I'm going to get into with you in a moment, is about getting in and out of it. But because we're a representative republic, and as you said, every vote should count, and I don't disagree with that. But our country's history says that we are 50 individual states that have joined a compact in a way already to govern the country on certain issues, but that we need to retain our individual autonomy as states. So I guess what I'm asking is there any fear on your part that the state of Connecticut, especially being a small state, will lose some of its autonomy and its individual ability to make its own choices in the situation where a national popular vote exists?
Well, no, because the state is still administering its election, just as it always does. And so I guess I'd say, if any concern I would have might be that different states administer things differently. But as I've studied this and looked at the administration of elections across the country, I think I'm pretty comfortable that they're being administered pretty well in almost every state. We would be, there are different states that operate differently, but it's a national election. I think that's part of the package. And our history also suggests that the Electoral College was envisioned in a certain way at a certain time. For example, African Americans were considered 3/5 of the person, and women didn't vote at all. So, things do change over time. And
those are two valuable changes that we've made. There's no question about it.
And so I'm just saying, I'm not sure that we can take our exact situation today and compare it to when the Electoral College was put in place. I'm not sure it's actually functioning the way they envisioned it at the time. Not to say that, it was an effort to kind of recognize differences in the country at the time. And I think this is kind of the same thing.
Right. No, and this is a public hearing, obviously, and I want to give you an opportunity to answer the questions. If this was a different forum, I might debate you on some of those issues, and,
sure.
and I will not do that here. I'm sure we're going to have the opportunity to debate all of that at some point.
Sure you will.
I just really want to get your perspective more than anything else. The only thing I would say about that is that the way politics is done today is that each of us elected officials on any level, municipal or state or federal level, we obviously cater to our constituencies. And if there are more people in a particular district or segment of our population that we actually have electing us, we're certainly going to cater to their needs. And I think that the danger of a national popular vote is that you have a presidential candidate catering only to the needs of those population centers and potentially ignoring other parts of the country. Just like, if I have a handful of people in my district that are opposed to an issue, I'm going to cater to the people that are in favor of it. Do you see any danger in that?
Well, no, right now, we kind of have the opposite problem, don't we? I mean, we have the problem that only 4 or 5 states matter, and so that's another kind of problem, on the opposite end. So I think either way, it's hard to, I haven't done the full round of speculation about what would happen and what the various permutations are, but, right now, that's one of the reasons this is coming up.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on history, but I'm sure that, some folks that will come up later will show us that states have changed. I mean, Texas was once a Democrat state, now it's a Republican state. And you never can predict what state is going to make a difference. And, to me, that's the value of the Electoral College, is that Connecticut might only have a few small votes, but sometimes those few small votes can make a big difference. And I think that the actual votes in Connecticut should determine how we hand out our electoral votes. If 3.2 million people vote against the candidate and we ultimately give our electoral votes to the other person, I don't know how that can be identified as one person, one vote. I don't see how that works. In practice, let me ask you a question, though. If we join the compact, which is what most of these bills are about, it's basically saying that we are going to change the way we award our votes to say that if the national election turns out a certain way, the national popular vote, rather, then we're going to give our votes to that person. When do we have to join the compact by for it to be in effect? And a better question is, are we in there forever, or is there a way to get out?
I have to say again, I probably somewhere buried in here, I have all the detail on that, but I do know 11 states, I believe, have joined. We join a number of other states that have already done this. And I don't know the ins and outs of the exact provisions of the compact, but it seems like it's well-trodden ground. So I don't know if we're in it forever. I believe we are.
Well, I think that my understanding is that that you're not in it forever.
Oh, no.
If we can, as a legislature, decide how we're going to hand out our electoral votes, then we can just as easily change that at some point in the future. And to me, that seems like one of the dangers of the whole thing, is that once we're in, we might see things a little bit differently. What if the next election comes up and all the people in this room would much rather do it the other way? Do you see that could create a legal problem?
Well, I presume that this legislature could make decisions other than this one. Once you join the compact, it doesn't stop the legislature from making further law on the subject, I would imagine.
Right, and again, I mean, but that's my point, is that I think that it creates a danger that you're going to have nothing but a legal fight over how each state ends up deciding to give away their electoral votes every election based on their assumption of how it's going to turn out. Whereas we have a long-standing policy that protects the individual policy desires of individual states. I mean, for instance, I'll use the state budget as an example. I mean, right now, there's a lot of us that are looking at the state budget as a battle, a war between the small towns and the big cities. And the elected officials in this room and across the Capitol obviously are looking out for their constituencies. But you see that, I represent a small town, so I'm going to try and advocate that, my taxpayers are protected and they receive their benefits, and someone else is. If the person who's on top of that is getting to make the choice of where he's going to send his benefits and how he's going to adopt policies, he's going to do it to the benefit of those population centers at the expense of the others. That doesn't concern you at all, especially being from one of the smallest states in the country.
That's democracy.
Well,
every person gets a vote.
As we started from the outside, it's not a democracy.
But you're electing someone who's president of the entire country. There are many other checks and balances in place to provide for protections for various populations and everything else. We have 3 branches of government. This is a national election. It should have national scope. And I think it's also about the trust of people in the system. I think people find it very hard to understand how people can vote and someone can win with more votes and still not win. I think, and that may be the most important thing about it.
Right. Well, with regard to the last election, clearly, the reason why the election turned out the way it was is because the candidates, both of them, were campaigning in a certain way. Had they been campaigning for the national popular vote, I think you might have seen their campaigns being done in a different way. You might seen the Republican candidate showing up in areas that he wouldn't have otherwise gone to because it was a lost cause. California is a perfect example. I mean, I don't think there was much chance for a Republican victory in California, so it was probably ignored. The thing is, practicing all weekend for a baseball game doesn't make any sense if you're playing a football game on Monday. Just one more final try at this conversation about whether we're a democracy or not. I mean, I'm sure you've heard many different metaphors about democracy as two lions and a Bambi fighting over what they're going to have for lunch. That would end up being a very bad democracy for that deer. So we have a representative form of government on purpose. In fact, every one of us here represents the people in our district, and obviously each one of those people do not get to have a say on every issue. But I think there's value in the states having an individual say when they have very, very small populations, but they might have, how about an example? Southern states might decide that northern states ought to pay a much higher tax for heating oil. And maybe that heating oil could be used for something that benefits the South. If there are more votes in the South, can you see how someone in a position of power might cater to those people at the expense of the others?
All I can say again is that states have certain oversight of certain topics, and you saw it play out in the presidential election. Of course, presidential candidates are always going to pay attention, not necessarily to states, but they're paying attention to populations and people with opinions and issues and all kinds of different things. But I think the thing that's really gotten this going is, once again, we had a situation where most people felt their vote didn't count because all the votes were being counted through the Electoral College in 5 states. And that's the problem, because modern, whether it's gerrymandering of districts and all the different factors that have come into play here, it has served to change the scope of the Electoral College, I believe.
I would argue that most people who feel their votes didn't count only feel that way because their candidate didn't win, not because of the way that they...
I am going to ask you
Anyway.
to... I'm going to... You two can
I was
continue.
done asking my questions anyway, Mr. Chairman.
But
Thank
I'm
you very
going
much.
to ask the audience to help me by refraining from outbursts. It will make the day, which is going to be very long, much longer, and it is not in keeping with what we normally do. I appreciate people's perspective, but we would like to move along and have the discussion actually happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you very much for being here, Tara. Most of the discussion today has been about philosophy more than anything, and I want to continue on that just for a second, but do not let me leave you without talking about what will actually happen in practice. To me, this whole thing is about states' rights. It seems to me in order to be in favor of a national popular vote, you have to be in favor of getting rid of the autonomy of the individual states. And I just wonder if you'd speak to that. My whole concern is that I represent people in this state, and this state does matter. We have our own state government. We have our own borders. We get our own funding from the government. We run our own show here. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to transfer how our electors are delivered to the president, that could be from some other source, is that a concern?
So, yes, it's a concern for sure. I heard somebody up here earlier today say something like, the United States has always been trying to get closer and closer to democracy since we started, and look, I think we all agree there's some aspects of that have been great. I'm glad I get to vote. I mean, there are some things about that are nice. But there have been some respects in which we have taken a Republican, small r, safeguard out of our Constitution, and we have suffered for it. And I'm going to say one that's not going to be popular with some people behind me. but the 17th Amendment actually hurt us a lot. The 17th Amendment now that changed the election so that instead of you guys picking your state senators to go to, or for DC, now everybody votes for it. Well, the United States Senate used to be a voice for the state in the Congress, and it was deliberately set up that way. You have one side of Congress talking for the states and one side of Congress talking for the people. And it's because we're a federalist nation where the states have their own powers and responsibilities and duties. Now, since this happened, we removed the state's voice from Congress, and now states can't defend themselves. So you guys struggle all the time with unfunded mandates that are handed down to you by the United States Congress because they don't care how you're going to pay for it. It's not their problem. Now, when the Senate was being elected by you guys, they cared a little bit more way back then. And I just mention that because it is one respect in which, again, a safeguard, a check and balance was stripped from our Constitution, and it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. It just seemed like you're respecting democracy. But in the end, it ended up hurting everybody. And so I feel that the consequences of removing this safeguard from our Constitution are a lot more far-reaching than probably anybody can anticipate. JFK, I'll just conclude with this part. JFK was a big defender of the Electoral College, believe it or not. And one time on the Senate floor, he got up there and he said, we've got this solar system of government power, and you can't change one aspect of the solar system and expect everything else just to stay like it was. You know, so if you change the gravitational pull of the sun, you change everything else. You know, Earth might become uninhabitable because it gets pulled closer or whatever. So in the same way, I believe that if we remove the Electoral College from our system of checks and balances, the ramifications of that action are probably somewhat unpredictable, but they'll be far-reaching.
Understood. And kind of exactly what I was driving at with some of the conversation I had earlier about how being a relatively small state and having less influence in a giant national popular election, there may be less attention to Connecticut than even now when we have the potential of being a swing state. Is that possible?
You know, yes. I mean, I've heard also all this talk today about only 5 states matter or whatever it is. I mean, respectfully to everybody, like, that's ridiculous. I mean, this year Hillary Clinton lost because she couldn't hold on to 3 safe states. In 2000, West Virginia, I mean, everybody focuses on Florida, but actually West Virginia's 5 electoral votes that year were decisive. I mean, it was a safe blue state flipped by the Republicans, and that changed the whole election. There are, you know, and after the Reagan years, there was so much talk, you know, there was like all these red states, including California, and people thought there was no way we could ever change that. Well, then Bill Clinton came along, and all of a sudden it became the total opposite. And so it's just, these things change all the time is my point. If you look at the history of any particular state, it goes back and forth, it changes. Predictions by media commentators about who's got the Electoral College advantage flips back and forth, and that's because at different points in time, different political parties are doing a better job of reaching out to a variety of voters. And I, again, contend that is a really healthy thing. I don't think we saw too much of that last year, but the first party to figure out their mistakes will really benefit fast.
Right. I appreciate that comment, being someone who, replaced someone who was a, 4-term incumbent who would win election after election by sizable margins and was told that you'll never be able to defeat that person. And I just think that, anytime you need to come up with some other plan on how to win an election rather than to mobilize your forces and convince people you're right and win the election, you're not doing it the right way.
Yeah, I agree.
So Senator Looney was before us, and he mentioned that it seems like a lot of money from the federal government tends to go into swing states. Assuming the national popular vote is adopted, do you see that changing to states that have more influence because they're largely populated?
I think 2 things will happen pretty quickly if we get rid of the Electoral College. And I do think NPV is getting rid of the Electoral College. One is I think the focus will change to densely populated areas, wherever those are. And whether it's got to do with candidate time or money or just attention to their issues, I think more focus will go on the densely populated areas. The second thing that I think will happen is that the 2-party system will fall apart. And, there are some negatives about the 2-party system that we all feel from time to time, and I'm not pretending that there aren't. But I'm reminded of something that sometimes I adapt something Winston Churchill said, and he said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. So I don't really agree with him about democracy. I prefer republics. But his point is just, everything's imperfect. And so it's the 2 parties, and you pick the best of the lot, right? So the 2-party system, frustrating. Sometimes we all want to vote for a 3rd-party candidate, whatever. But as I pointed out earlier, look, the alternative is this multi-party, fractured, no incentive to work together, divided 17 ways, who cares? I mean, this kind of thing does happen in France sometimes, where you end up with a runoff between two candidates and they got maybe 20% of the vote or something to get in. So it's not far-fetched. I mean, this is what would happen. And I would rather personally work my way through the frustrations of the two-party system and encourage the parties to kind of get back on track and do a better job of coalition building than to enter a world like France where you end up with a choice between an incumbent who got like 20% in the election and the extremist runoff candidate who got 19%. I mean, what kind of choice is that? Talk about not having a choice in an election.
Understood. Earlier today, I also alluded about our state government and how our governor basically, you could look at this as a microcosm of what would happen under a national popular vote. But the fact is that he has to try and win the popular vote in the state. And clearly, the way it's been done in recent times has been by making sure that folks that live in the major cities are more catered to. You can look at the most recent budget proposal and see that there's money flowing out of the towns who get pennies on the dollar back for what they put into our state government, and the major cities who reap the benefits of that. I'm afraid that that's what would happen on a national level, is that political attention is going to be driven towards places that make a difference in the election, and small, unpopulated places, maybe not even Connecticut, because we're a densely populated part of the country, but flyover states like Nebraska, I mean, what work would you have to do to make those people's votes matter to you? Is that a concern?
Of course. I mean, I think other states that experience this are New York, Texas, Dallas, Austin, Houston drive a lot of what's going on. California, LA, and San Francisco, and some of the bigger cities drive what's going on. And some of the people who are not the controlling party in those states get really frustrated by that, and they want to change that. And so I understand the frustration, but I don't understand why people think the frustration would not transfer to the national level, because clearly it would. I think it's just human nature, and part of it is just scheduling and time and resources, and what else are you going to do?
All right. I have one more philosophy question, then I'm going to just ask you about some practice things. And I guess it has to do with this most recent election and the thought of being disenfranchised. Do you think that necessarily the candidates themselves would have run a different election with a different outcome as far as the national popular vote goes? And I'm not saying the outcome would have been different. I'm sure it would have been different. I'm just not saying that Trump would have beat Clinton or anything like that in a popular vote.
Yeah.
I'm just suggesting that you believe that the way the campaign would have been run would have been vastly different.
And I think third-party candidates would have had a higher vote total. I think there were a lot of people that held their nose and voted for either candidate. But for sure, I mean, it would just all would have been different. I thought your analogy about football and baseball was great earlier.
Thank you. Okay, so on to practice. The one thing that I've been grappling with all day listening to this conversation is about the national popular vote. But we're not trying to do a national popular vote. None of the bills here are about that. And in fact, we don't have the power. That's something that only the Congress can make happen. All we can do is enter into a compact with other states. And the argument seems to fall apart for me there. If we're not going to be doing an actual national popular vote and every one single vote counts, that doesn't apply in this case. It would only mean that we have to give up our votes to what the total is. But other states would not have to do that. Can you just speak about the difference between the compact in practice versus an actual national popular vote?
To me, the whole thing is just really convoluted. Well, there are so many differences. Well, for one thing, where do I start? I think the biggest problem with that compact, they are trying to avoid the constitutional amendment process. And, whatever they say, many of their funders or whatever are on record saying we think the constitutional amendment is eventually going to come, and that's a good thing, and that's what, we're just trying to push it in the right direction. But because they are not abiding by Article 5, then, actually, let me back up a second. They keep on telling you have the power to do this, and there's no constitutional problem, et cetera. Well, the states do have great discretion to allocate their electors however they want to. However, you also have to comply with other provisions in the Constitution. So, for example, if you were to allocate your electors in some way that let men vote and didn't let women vote, that would be struck down because you're violating another provision in the Constitution. So if that use of Article 2 is in conflict with Article 5, well, then you're not going to be allowed to allocate your electors according to the compact. And there will be a lawsuit about it, and they're right, the Supreme Court will end up deciding the issue. But there are just there are so many legal problems that are going to follow from this. There will be equal protection lawsuits because somebody from Connecticut will file a lawsuit that says, I got less time to early vote than somebody in Minnesota. And then there's going to be some court that has to decide who has jurisdiction over this, Connecticut or Minnesota. Which court? I don't know. And there's going to be a lawsuit that says, hey, you counted a hanging chad this way in Wyoming, and now you want to count it this way in Florida. And there's going to be one that says, oh no, if I was a felon living in that state, I could vote, and I'm a felon living in this state and I can't vote. I mean, all of these things, once you create a big national election pool with 51 sets of different laws, all of this stuff starts to matter. So, and I'll reiterate that one of the 3 professors that created this idea has acknowledged that in writing. So I think that they're aware of that, and I think that they just figure they'll get the constitutional amendment eventually because the problems will become overwhelming.
Understood. And the other thing that I can imagine is that if a state itself wants to maintain its autonomy and its sovereignty and its ability to have an impact, especially if they're a smaller state like Connecticut, what we need to do is make sure we get more votes from Connecticut. So it seems to me that there's a possibility that you would have a race to register voters like crazy, which may sound like a good thing, except does it also create an incentive to have fraudulent vote counts? And how do we keep track of whether or not another state is accurate in their voting if their motivations are different than ours?
Sounds like another lawsuit to me, but I think you're right that there will be a race to the bottom, and every state will be incentivized to turn out its vote, not only in good ways, because there are some good ways, but also in fraudulent or not so good ways. Maybe you'll lower the voting age, or I don't know, give felons the right, or there will just be as many ideas as you can think of to try to turn out more and more and more people. So again, some will be good, some won't be good, and so I would rather have a system where each state is in control of itself and can determine what's going to happen in its own borders if the identity of its electors or the identity of its president is going to be controlled by the outcome of votes cast in its state.
Thank you very, very much, Tara. You brought a lot of light to the discussion. I know everyone has a passionate feeling about this, both on the committee and in the public, but it's very helpful to have someone who's given actual, real, in-depth thought into what happens under all of these possibilities. So I really appreciate you being here to share your expertise with us. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Anything further? Yes. Representative Winkler.